Hi, everyone. We are now moving into Module 2. This module includes quite a few readings, and it will help us to better understand the socio-political context of schooling. So, in the module that you just completed, we took a look at culture and understanding our own cultural identity. And now we're going to move into discussing how schools address culture or not, as the case may be, as we'll learn, and how the organizational structure of schools and even the entire way that our school system is set up in this country um, hasn't always been supportive of people who are diverse in a variety of ways. And so the first four chapters in the textbook really help us to dive into some of these different areas in terms of the history of the context of schooling in this country, some information about multicultural education over time. And then chapters 3 and 4 really get into racism, discrimination, and how that all plays into the way that schools are structured in this country. So, looking at the course schedule, this is where we're at. So we are in Module 2, which is intended to be completed June 16th through 23rd, but as I've said, can be a little bit flexible in terms of our timing, as long as you have your second reflective discussion completed by 10 p.m. on June 23rd. So you should be able, to access everything through Canvas just as before. So going into modules, completing that. I don't have this module or the module for this week completely set up yet because that's what I'm doing right now is recording the information for the module. So you'll be able to see the information for module 2 here once I have that completed. All right, so let's go into our presentation. So in chapter 1, you read about the context of schooling in the socio-political context of schooling. And some important things for us to keep in mind as we are moving through our discussion related to these topics is that schools do not exist in isolation. All right. So I think sometimes we have a perception that, especially for those of you who may be like me and went to um, lived in a more rural area, and there was only one elementary school and one middle school and one high school, or maybe even those were combined. We sometimes might think that schools exist in isolation, right? Like they're their own little bubble, and everything that happens within the school is controlled by the people within the school. But as we will discuss in this class, and I'm sure you've learned probably by now, is that schools don't really work like that. Schools have to be part of a larger system. So a school is a part of a school district, and a school district is a part of a regional office of education. And that is, kind of overseen by the Illinois State Board of Education, which takes some directives from the Department of Education at the federal level. And so what that means is that inherently schooling is political, and that school funding is tied to property taxes, which means that certain schools receive more money than others. As we've probably seen, or you've probably seen on the news, more and more people are getting involved in schooling in terms of what's being taught, how it's being taught. And so what that means is that schooling isn't necessarily neutral. It can be a very emotionally, politically charged environment. Even if it doesn't feel that way in your classroom, the impacts on things that you are told to teach and how you're told to teach can be related to some of those more, those larger structures within our society. And so as we start moving through and talking about this more, we will be looking at some of the laws that are in place, regulations, policies, practices, traditions, things that have been in place for a long, long time that we may not really even think about being the way that they are because they've always been that way as long as we've been in school. And so part of what, and I think I mentioned this in the first module, I'm hoping that you get from this class is to really question why things are the way that they are, right? And not in a way that every single thing that we do in education is bad or wrong, but just to question why things happen the way that they do. And even more so than that, how the policies and practices and pieces that are in place within our society regarding schooling are more inclusive and support some students more than others. And so part of this whole class is helping us think about how we can support all of our students to feel welcome and to feel included, not just some of our students. So that's a lot of what we will be talking about as we move through this course. So in chapter 1, we start talking about multicultural education and why we even have multicultural education. And so initially, and we'll read more about this in chapter 2 as well, when we started thinking about multicultural education, it was really about looking at the inequities within our educational system. And it was one of the first times that we started thinking, and this even goes back to the civil rights era and other, big eras in our social or society, in our history, our country's history, is, why some children have access to certain things in public school and other children don't. If it's all truly public school, we all should be having relatively similar experiences. And as you know, that is certainly hasn't always been the case, and to this day isn't necessarily true. So thinking about that, thinking about how we can support all children, again, to have access to high quality education and being able to help everybody succeed and have high levels of achievement. And then thinking about ultimately how we can support students to be more productive members of society, which is one of our goals, of course, of public education. So how do we do that? In chapter 1, we start thinking about different elements related to multicultural education. And we're going to be exploring these a little bit more. And throughout your textbook, as you're reading each chapter, you'll be reading about specific scenarios that kind of help us understand the context related to what life might be like for a real life student. And these pictures on the side depict some of those characters that we'll be getting to know as we move through the chapters in our text. So in chapter 1, we really start unpacking, the difference between what does it mean to have equal opportunities or equal education and equitable education. We talk about that term social justice, which is thrown around a lot, but a lot of times we don't actually understand or know what that means. In the first module, we talked a little bit about the achievement gap. We'll get into that more in chapter 1. And then finally, talk a little bit more about deficit theories and how that can play a part in what multicultural education looks like for all students. So when we think about equal education and equitable education, we really want to be thinking about how we can provide students with equitable opportunities for getting what they need, right? So when we think about equal education, it means that everybody gets the same thing, which I might not necessarily need the exact same thing in my learning and education that you need or that the person sitting next to you needs. And so for a long time, we talked about having equal education or equal opportunities, when really what we need to be thinking about is equitable, which is, again, giving every student what they need in order to be successful. And you'll see down here a couple of different, cartoons or pictures. The one on the right, if you can't see it, I know it's a little bit hard. It's a man sitting at a desk, and he says, "For a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree." Well, you can imagine that the elephant and the dog and the seal and the fish and the penguin are saying, "Wait, what?" The monkey's like, "Okay, I just aced this test." And the bird's like, "I can get to the top of that tree." So if you think about giving everybody the same, it isn't what everybody needs in that example and in life. The one to the left, thinking about equality, giving everybody the same thing, which means that the ability to succeed is reduced for those who start at a disadvantage. So it's no secret that everybody in this world does not start off on the same place, an equal level playing field. And some people need more supports to get to the starting point where a lot of people start, right? And equality means that, if we give everybody the same thing, everybody's going to have the same information, but not opportunities, if that makes sense. Where equity, everybody's given what they need, but sometimes it's a little bit challenging to figure out what it is that they need, right? And so in other classes that you'll be taking, you'll be talking about getting to know your students and assessing your students and learning about them to understand what they need in order to give them what they need in order to be successful. And so I like to think about this as something that we all can understand, right? So just despite where we grew up, what type of school we went to, the color of our skin, how much money our family has, we all can understand things like needing glasses to be able to see, okay? So some of us need glasses to be able to see far away. Some of us need glasses to be able to see close up. Some of us don't need glasses at all right? And so I need glasses to be able to see far away and close up. So if everybody in this class was given my glasses, it would not help them be able to see. My glasses are designed specifically for me. My eye doctor looks at my eyes and tests my vision and says, "This is what you need to be able to see the best that you possibly can," right? But again, if I went to the eye doctor and they said, "We only have one kind of glasses, and that's the only kind of prescription that you can get. Good luck to you." We'd have a world full of people who couldn't see very well, right? And so if we think about what education looks like, if we give everybody the same education and hope for the best, there will be some that are like, "Oh, hey, this works for me." Like if nobody could get glasses, the people who don't need glasses would be like, "Oh yeah, this is cool. I can do this." But for all those people who need glasses, they'd be like, "Yeah, this is not really working for me," right? And so thinking about that, we need to think about how we can figure out that prescription, right? So just like our eye doctor finds out the prescription for our glasses, we need to figure out the prescription for our students and what they need in order to be successful. And multicultural education helps us to do that. So in terms of social justice, like I said, this is a term that's thrown around a lot. And as you learned in the textbook, the definition for social justice is a philosophy, an approach, and actions that embody treating all people with fairness, respect, dignity, and generosity. So that sounds great, but what does that look like in practice? So what this looks like in practice is, as teachers and helping our students, to be able to understand when there are inequities and to address those, to disrupt those, to challenge those stereotypes and myths that sometimes we have about specific students and what their abilities are. It looks like providing students with the necessary resources to be successful. So figuring out what that prescription for the student's learning is, and then applying that for each of our students in a way that will benefit them the most. It means recognizing what the students walk into your classroom having, their lived experiences, the opportunities that they've had or not had, and then building on what they have to help them to be a better version of themselves. And it really means for you as the teacher, creating an environment that is welcoming, that is inclusive, where everyone feels that they have the opportunity to become a better version of themselves and are given the opportunity to really explore what that means for them as an individual and that space to be able to figure that out. And so you've probably heard of the achievement gap. Well, I'm sure you have because we learned about it a little bit in Module 1. But the achievement gap is really this phrase that we started using to describe that gap, the space in between learning and achievement for different students who have different opportunities. And so typically when we think about the achievement gap, it is a description of that gap between where students who have a higher income, who are part of that dominant culture, so we talked in Module 1 about dominant cultures and subcultures and things like that. But so students who are part of the dominant culture, who are white, who come from more privileged backgrounds, who have access to better schooling, no secret, tend to do better on standardized tests, tend to have higher levels of achievement, and things like that. Traditionally, students from lower income backgrounds, from minority groups, tend to not do as well on standardized tests, and we'll get more into that later, and tend to achieve less than their higher income dominant group counterparts. And so that's kind of how we think about the achievement gap. But the authors, as you read in chapter 1, always use achievement gap with these, quotation marks around it, because the issue that they have, and I agree, is that when we think about the achievement gap, we don't really talk about where schooling plays into this, right? And as a result, when we think about this definition for achievement gap, it tends to really put the onus or the issue with those minority groups, those kind of students who are on the outside, not a part of that dominant group. And so it does not address the issues of unequal schooling, right? It puts more of that responsibility on the students versus on the schools to address those challenges in not meeting the needs of all of their students. Okay, so let me rephrase this. So it's not necessarily, the achievement gap should be seen less as an issue of children coming from low income backgrounds, children from minority groups, and so on, not doing well in school. It should be more of, why are they not doing well in school? And what are schools doing to address their needs so that they could be doing better in school? So instead of thinking about it as an issue for those children who are from those non-dominant groups, think about it as a schooling issue of like, what can we be doing to address the needs of these children? And multicultural education should help us to do that. All right, and then finally, deficit perspectives. So, an issue that we um, sometimes have, well, not sometimes, we all have probably experienced in our schooling is when people have an assumption that some students will succeed and other students will not. All right. And this really kind of gets back to what we discussed in Module 1 about understanding ourselves, understanding our own culture, understanding our experiences, and what makes us think the way that we do about certain students. And what we know is that traditionally in education, two children who walk through a classroom door, and nobody knows anything about those two children. If one child is African American and one child is white, traditionally, a teacher may have different expectations for those two children just based on the color of their skin, right? And obviously, that's a problem, right? So, over time, school practices, teacher attitudes, and beliefs have assumed, and I'm using the big kind of global school, not individual teachers necessarily, assumed that some children are going to be able to achieve more than others just based on where they come from, how much money their parents make, if their parents are divorced or not, where they live. And obviously, that's a problem. And so we need to address those deficit perspectives. Where do those deficit perspectives come from? Um, I'm sure you all have heard of implicit bias, right? So, again, thinking about our own experiences, our own beliefs, the messages that we've been sent throughout our lives, whether it be from our parents, from our community, from our own schooling, from what we see on the news, we get messages that some people are okay and some people are not okay. And so we have to wrestle with that because we want to try to create these classroom spaces where everybody is welcome, everybody feels included, and everybody is okay, right? And so sometimes that means we have to look at within ourselves and think, okay, do I have some implicit biases? Do I have some biases that are keeping me from being the best teacher that I can be for all of my students? Right. So we're going to watch a couple of video clips that help us to think about this a little bit more. And there'll probably be an ad that pops up because I forgot to click on this ahead of time. All right, so I know we don't always like to think about the biases that we have, but it's important for us to think about the biases that we have. And if you haven't spent a lot of time exploring implicit bias and you watch that video, you might be like, well, they said that we may not even know what they are. And that's true. And that's why you're in a class like this, is to help you think about things like, when I see an African American man walking toward me and I'm going down the street, do I hold my purse closer? If I were approaching an older white gentleman, would I have the same response, right? So it's those little messages that go through our head. Or if, think about, well, you all are too young to think about post September 11th, but right after September 11th, there was a huge Middle Eastern sentiment. And so, if you saw somebody who was wearing a hijab, people might have a negative association with that person. They know absolutely nothing about that individual. But because I have a negative association with people from that part of the world, I might have a negative association about that person, right? And so implicit biases come from all of those messages, as they said in the video, that we've received over time, that somebody who receives welfare is lazy and doesn't want to work. Is that true? Probably not. But we've heard messages at different points in our lives. Some of us have, maybe not all of us, that, maybe, a person who's on welfare, they just want to keep having kids so that they can get more money. That's probably not really true. Or things like some parents just don't care about their kids. Deep down, don't really believe that's true. Or they don't want to participate in their child's or help with their child's education. Also, probably not true. And so a lot of times implicit biases are based on assumptions that we make based on messages that we've received from a variety of different places in our lived experience. And so we're going to watch another video that talks about this in relation to who we are as teachers. And it starts really fast, so I want to get here. All right, so hopefully that video helped you to get a different perspective, right? And so what I hope that you got from that video is, well, for one, you are probably a little bit shocked, right? Because we don't like to think that we have these biases. And so the teachers in that study, it's not that they're bad people, because I think sometimes when we see video clips like that, we think, oh gosh, I would never be that way. I would never have those thoughts. But chances are we might, right? And so what we know about implicit biases is that those are things that happen that we may not necessarily even be able to control. What we can control is how we respond, right? And so I'm not asking you to control your thoughts 100% of the time. What I am asking you to do is, when you have specific thoughts, to pause and think, why am I thinking that? Why is that my go-to? Why am I making an assumption about this particular child or this group of people? And so that moment where we can pause and sort of consider and think, that's where we can really make a change. And so when we think about what this means for our lives in the classroom and in schooling, you will undoubtedly hear messages like the one on the left. When you're in the teacher's lounge, you may even have some of these thoughts yourselves from time to time. The child's father is in prison. The mom is completely overwhelmed. No wonder this poor kid's a mess, right? Which, okay, fair. Maybe you have that thought, but where do we go with that? That makes it seem like there is absolutely nothing that can ever be done to help this child. Let's just give up on him now, right? Which is obviously not what we want to do. So when we have that initial thought, we want to think, okay, or if we have that initial thought, or if you hear that when you're in the teacher's lounge, pause and try to think of it from a more strengths-based perspective, right? So acknowledging that everybody has challenges, everybody needs support, and how can we move forward? So we always want to be thinking about how we can reframe things into a better way of thinking, into a different perspective. So instead of thinking, there's nothing I can do for this child, maybe we want to reframe it to say, you know what, all families have challenges. How can I support this child to be successful, right? Or how can I support this family during this time that's really challenging for them? Here's another one. Some children will never be able to learn like other children, bottom line. Wow, okay, that's something right there. So, whoopsie, I'm sorry. So if we think about that one, so I'm going to go back here. Some people, I hope that none of us feel that way, first of all. But if something like that, because these messages sometimes come out of frustration, right? I've been working with this kid for a long time. I can't get through to this child. I don't know what else to do. And that's more about us than it is about the child, right? So we have to pause and think about that. If we start having thoughts like this, we need to think about how can we reframe this from a more positive perspective, maybe recognizing that this is about me and my frustrations, not being able to reach the child. So maybe a more strengths-based approach could be, I need to figure out a different way to help this child learn better. I need to seek to better understand what's going on in this child's life so that I can be more supportive of this child in their learning, right? What about this one? I don't think there's anything I can do to fix this child. There's just too much that's happened in their lives. Well, there's a lot of issues in that, right? Like, first of all, we're not in the business of fixing children. But some children have had a lot of things happen in their lives, and that is the case for all of us, right? And so we want to be thinking about, what can we do to support this child in my classroom today? How can I help this child be successful today? And so again, seeking to understand, learning more, trying to find out different things that we can do to help the child to be successful is the important thing. And then finally, this last one. If parents value education, the child would succeed. Look at Anna's family. They come to school every day. She has no behavioral issues. Okay, well, again, lots of loaded issues here, lots of loaded statements in this, that we're making assumptions, right? We're making assumptions that because Anna's family is involved, she's going to be more successful in school than another child whose family isn't as involved. What we don't know is everything that's happening in every child's life, right? And so when we start to say things or think things like, that family just doesn't care about their child's education, or if that child's family really cared, they would come to school events, or they would participate in parent teacher conferences, or blah, 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 blah. We have no idea what other competing priorities are happening within children's lives and within families' lives that are keeping that family from being a part of their child's education. And so if we start to make assumptions about the child based on things that are happening with the family, that's a very slippery slope that sometimes leads us to deficit thinking instead of thinking about what the child and the family do bring to the table, which is really what we want to try to build on. Because when we start from that really negative space, it can sometimes be challenging for us to think anything but those negative thoughts. All right, so as we wrap up chapter 1, and I'm going to have to start talking faster as we move through, or this is going to be a 4-hour presentation, and I promise it won't be. Chapter 1 helps us to understand some of the things that are happening that underlie the need for multicultural education. All right. When we think about how our schooling operates, public schooling particularly, we're always going to be using the frame of public schooling, operates within our country, we can really start to see at play why some children succeed and some children don't, and where these inequities lie. And so as we move through chapter 2, 3, and 4, we're going to be thinking about things like school funding. And, you know, for those of you who don't know, spoiler alert, school funding in the United States, and definitely in the state of Illinois, is based on property taxes, which means that neighborhoods that have higher income families, that have higher priced houses, have higher tax rates, have more money that go into those schools, which from the get-go means that kids who live in those neighborhoods have access to schools that receive more funding than children who live in neighborhoods where there's less funding. And so before they ever step foot in the door of the school, there's inequities at play, right? And so we want to be talking about, what does that mean for us as teachers? Because we can't necessarily control we can't control the fact, besides voting and, advocating that, that's how schools are funded in this country. But what we can do is think about the policies that are in place within the school and how we respond to those policies within our classroom spaces in supporting students to be successful. All right, so in chapter 2, we really start thinking about what multicultural education is and why we have multicultural education. As we discussed in chapter 1, we have a lot of policies in play within our country that mean that students don't always enter the school building with the same opportunities as other children, all right? And so when we think about that, we need to step back and look at the bigger picture and realize that we have a need for school reform, right? We have a need for looking at how we do things within schools in our country. And multicultural education is part of this process of looking at a solution versus the problem. I mean, we have to kind of look at the problem too, of like why we need school reform. But we know that we need opportunities for all of our students to receive equitable education, which again, remember, that means they receive what they need to be successful. And multicultural education really helps us to think about how every child can be successful, given who they are, where they come from, who their family is, all of those different things that play into that child's life and who they are when they walk in the door, we should be able to meet them at that door, help them walk through and be successful. But we know that that isn't always the case. And sometimes the reason for that is the policies that we have in place within schools. And so multicultural education really came from this thought of having a deeper understanding of our students and meeting them in the middle, so to speak. For a very long time, we thought multicultural education meant that, we have, as a second bullet point indicates, we have a world fair or a cultural fair one time a year where everybody shares something about their culture, and then that covered multicultural education. But what we really know is that we need to be intentional about looking at our policies and our practices and how we do things, our curriculum, and making sure that all of those different pieces of schooling support all of the students at the table within our classrooms, within our schools. And so what that means is that multicultural education is not it's not a one-time thing that we do. It's a part of everything that we do within our schools. Okay, so this is a process of school reform to make sure that everybody in a school, all students, have what they need to be successful. Multicultural education challenges, seeks to disrupt and pause this racism and other forms of discrimination in school and society, and really helps us to think about how everybody can be a part of the conversation and to be successful regardless of their ethnicity, race, language that they speak, the religious background, their economic background, gender, everything. That we all, despite who we are, where our backgrounds come from, that we all come together to think about how all children can be successful and learn. And really looking at the notion that to do this, we have to examine every element of what happens within our schools. Because what we know is that sometimes some of those systemic racist thoughts and beliefs and ideologies make their way into our policies and our practices, and we don't even recognize it because they've been there, and it's just the way that we've been doing things for a very long time. What we want to do is examine those policies and practices and curriculum and think about how can we remove those pieces that we don't want and instead replace them with more accepting, more equitable, more opportunities for everybody to be successful in our schools. And so when we think about what multicultural education is, Sonia Nieto, which is one of the authors of our textbook, says that multicultural education is a lot of things, all right? It is also not some things. So one thing that it is not, it's not a curriculum, right? It's not something that we can go to a conference and go to the exhibit hall and look at a curriculum, and somebody's going to try to sell you something that says, like, if you want multicultural education in your school, buy this curriculum and includes everything that you need. If that ever happens, be wary of that, because that's really not the way multicultural education works, right? It's not a one-time deal. It's something that, again, has to be a part and permeates everything within our school, our structure, our curriculum. So what multicultural is, or education is it is anti-racist education. And I know we don't like necessarily using that word racism because nobody wants to think that they're racist. But guess what? All of us at some point in our life have had some type of racist thought that somebody is not as good, is not equal because of the color of their skin, all right? And so we want to make sure that we are actively, systematically thinking about how we can address racism and discrimination. And we're going to get more into this in chapter 3 within our schools, because many people within education and within our society, to be honest, are in denial about the fact that they have racist thoughts, that they have thoughts that some people can be successful and other people cannot. And so we really want to tackle that. And we're going to talk more about that, like I said, in chapter 3. Multicultural education is basic education. And that means that everybody it's a part of everything that we do. All right. So again, it's not a curriculum. It's not something that we teach, at the end of the day, once a week. This is something that needs to be embedded into everything that we do. Multicultural education is important for all students. I think at different points there have been thoughts or beliefs that we only really need to do multicultural education for the kids who are white to learn about other cultures, or kids who don't speak another language to learn about different languages. But really, multicultural education is for everybody, right? It's really looking at how we can collectively come together to be a community of learners that supports each other, no matter who we are, no matter our background, all of those different types of things. So we really need to examine, this idea of multicultural education for everyone, not just for the people of the dominant culture or dominant groups, or just for those who are in the non-dominant groups. Multicultural education is pervasive in that it's not something, like I said, that is covered in a lecture. It's not something that is taught just once or twice. It's something that should be a part of everything that we do, that should be reflected in our classroom materials, our books, our curriculum that we teach should be a part of everything. Multicultural education is for social justice. It is social justice. So this is about not just including everyone, but actively seeking out ways to disrupt these notions and these thoughts that some people can learn and other people can't learn. Some kids are going to be successful and other kids are not going to be successful. And so thinking about how that plays. Multicultural education is a process, right? It's one of the challenges. I remember sitting in on a webinar one time about anti-racist pedagogy and the way that we teach. And something that really struck me was the speaker said that to really address racist thoughts, beliefs, to really dig deep into creating multicultural systems for our students and as a society, our work is really never done. And as a nation, we are a nation who's literally built, like our Capitol building and many important buildings in our country and our roads, all kinds of things have been built using labor from people who did not choose those jobs and those professions. All right. So when we think about the fact that our nation is literally built on this idea that some people are inferior to others, it sometimes can be a little bit hard for us to untangle all of that from who we are individually. And so why I bring this up is that this is a process because none of us in our lifetimes have ever truly lived in a society that is inclusive of everyone, that is open and has opportunities that are equal for every person. And so this is a process partially because we've never completely figured this out. And as teachers, part of our role is to hopefully help figure this out. So we're going to, again, unpack that more in chapter 3. And then finally, multicultural education is critical pedagogy. It's questioning why things are the way that they are. It's looking at things from different perspectives. It's challenging issues that come up and, again, questioning, okay, so if we do this way and this isn't benefiting all of our students, why are we continuing to do it this way, right? So it's really being critical and thinking about how we teach, why we teach the way that we do. All right, so we're covering a lot here. Chapter 3 really gets into this notion of racism, discrimination, and expectations of students' achievement. So we cover a lot. There's a lot in this chapter. So please, please, please read this chapter carefully. I include this slide here because I think when we think about race and racism is really largely, well, we know that it's a social construct, right? So what that means is that it's a made up thing, right? So the fact that we are, as humans, 99.9% identical in our genetic makeup should make us think, wow, we are so much more alike than we are different. That said, the things that make us different, that make us each unique, is that 0.1% of our genetic makeup, all right? So who we are on the inside, we all have blood running through our veins. We all have lungs that help us breathe. We have brains that help us think. We have all of these different things that help us to be who we are and to be human. But what sets us apart from each other are things like the color of our hair, the color of our skin, the color of our eyes, how tall we are, how short we are, how much we weigh, all of those different things, as well as the language that we speak, the country that we come from. Those are things that make us unique. Those are the things that make us special. And I hate using that word special, but I think unique is a better word. But those are also the things that set us apart from each other. And those are the things that make us different from each other. And so when we think about race, like I said, this is a social construct. It artificially divides people into groups based on characteristics like the color of their skin, where they come from, their religious affiliation. And so when we think about that, the fact that for a large part of our nation's history, we divided people based on race, and some might argue that we still do because of opportunities and where people live and all of those, there is still segregation. It's kind of crazy to think about, truthfully. And then when we think about racism is really, if we think about race as a social construct that separates people, racism is all about power and control, all right? Who is in the dominant culture? Who has more power? Who has more control? And how can I use that power and control to keep people who are like me in power and control, all right? And that's really what it all comes down to, power and control. And I think in our country, power and control is often associated with money and who has more money, right? So when we think about race and racism, I include this last bullet point. Everything in our society is intertwined with race. And so it's never a matter of race or, it's always a matter of race and, because everything from our laws to the way that we do schooling to housing, healthcare, everything um, includes this racial element. And that's a part of our nation's history. And that's a part of many countries' history. And I'll be interested when to have you think about this in the perspective of your study abroad experience as well. All right. So if this is true, why don't we talk about it more? Right. So we're going to watch this video. Again, I might have to pause to get it. I'm going to pull it up here. So I really, this is the part of the class that's hard for me to do without being able to have a discussion with you. And I know we'll do the discussion post, but I really love that video for a number of reasons. I think that um, that she really helps us to think about race and racism in a way, or help me anyway, to think about it in a way that that challenges some of my thoughts about my own beliefs and perspectives. I feel like as a white woman that sometimes I do question like what is it, where do my thoughts come from about race, I can choose, like she said, you know, if you I really love the quote that she included about if I'm not at the party, like you should ask the host, right? And I think when we look around at people in power, that it often is the people who are white men, truthfully, who are still in power in many, many nations, including in Britain and in the United States for sure. And so why is that? Why is that the case, right? Why is it 2024 and we still don't have more representation? And again, it goes back to money, it goes back to power, it goes back to control of that dominant culture. Um, and so none of us like to think of ourselves as racist, right? And I don't know that any of us are 100% truly racist. But if we don't stop and ask those questions about why things are the way that they are and try to challenge that a little bit, it's very hard for us to move beyond where we are today. I was at a talk in the fall, and the speaker was talking about dominant culture and non-dominant cultures and how we can make sure that everybody, as she said, has an invitation to the party. In his case, he was talking about having a seat at the table, right? And the way that he described it is that some people are always going to have a seat at the table, all right? So when we think about people who always have a seat at the table, if we are comparing two groups, if we think about male versus female, who always has a seat at the table? The male. If we think about white or black, who always has a seat at the table? Somebody who's white. If we think about somebody who is from a higher income background or a lower income background, who always has a seat at the table? Higher income person, all right? So we don't have to work hard to bring those people to the table because they're already there. They've always been there. They want to stay there, quite truthfully. Those people who are on the outside, who are not white, who are female or other gender, who come from lower income backgrounds, who are just not part of those dominant cultures, those are the people who tend to be on the outside of the circle, right? Those are the people that we need to work on bringing in, to inviting to the party, to bringing and inviting them to a seat at the table. Because if we don't have those voices as a part of the conversation, we're going to keep creating policies and structures that benefit the people who do have a seat at the table. Because if you think about it, if you're in a school and you're working on policies and procedures for the school, you're going to create policies and procedures, hopefully, that reflect and benefit the students who are in your population. If I'm in an organization, if I'm part of a government structure, I'm going to think about what benefits me and the people that I work with. If I don't have those people who are on the fringe, those minority, those non-dominant cultural groups as a part of my thought process when I'm creating those policies and procedures, I'm not going to create policies and procedures that benefit them, and largely because they aren't part of those conversations where those policies are being made. And so we need to think about how we can include more people who are a part of who can be a part of the conversation, and that trickles down into what we do within schools. So when we think about racism, and we're focusing on racism in this chapter, we think about it as a bias, right? But we know that there are lots and lots of other forms of discrimination. So racism is specifically about the color of your skin and separating people out based on the color of their skin, right? But we know that discrimination happens in many, many forms based on gender, ethnicity, social class, language, sexual orientation, religious identities, disabilities, on and on and on and on and on, right? And so in schools, we see this play out where people who have disabilities are separated from the group, not as much as we used to be, but still. into special education and typical education, right? General education. Sometimes we see children who identify as different genders told they cannot do that, that you have to identify as your gender given at birth or your gender at birth. So we try to, kind of separate people out, bring people together, depending on what makes us comfortable, us being the people who are making the laws, who are making the policies. And we don't necessarily take into consideration what's best for everybody who's a part of that conversation and who's at the table. And so in chapter 3, we really, and again, I hope that you read through this. We're going to just skim this relatively quickly, but it's so important to understand the dimensions of race and racism within our country and how that looks in the discrimination that plays out within our policies, within our laws, within really everything that we do within our country, right? And when we think about the history and persistence of racism, not just in schools, but in every element of our society, it really does weave into every single piece. If we think about healthcare, if we think about housing, if we think about anything, even laws and the way that we structure our laws and policies, it has to do with this idea that some groups are okay and some groups are not okay. All right. So it's important for us to understand that this is a systemic issue. This is not something that we can just take a peek at our policies, make a few changes in wording, and everything's going to be okay, right? We really have to stop and unpack and look at everything within our policies and why we do what we do. Which as a teacher, we don't always have the power to make that happen. But where we do have the powers within our classrooms. And so we want to be always thinking about this as a systemic issue, not as a just one-off type of an issue. So, as we heard in the video, it's all of our responsibility to really think about our own perspectives. It's important for us to consider that the fact that we don't, or if we don't question, if we don't try to disrupt some of the racist policies that are built into our structures within schools and our government, um, that we can be contributing to this overall system that is supportive of some and not supportive of others. What I really liked about what she said, one of the things that I really liked is that we have to be thinking about the fact that all of us aren't um, born with on a level playing field, right? And so when we think about the example of Ebony and Emily, I really like that because I think it helps us to see throughout a child's experience how, and this isn't going to be true for every single person, we know that, but how just based on the color of a child's skin, where they're born, what their name is, they can have a different outlook or they can have a different outcome, excuse me, in their life. And they didn't start on a level playing field. And so how can we work systematically across our systems and in our society to create opportunities where everybody starts at a more equal place, right? And as long as we have policies and laws in place that are designed to keep some people down and keep some people in power, we're not going to be able to do that. And that's really where this idea of systemic discrimination and racism comes into play. And so, what does that specifically look like in schooling? It can look like a lot of different things. It often looks like we learned about the study where teachers have different expectations for students who are from different races and backgrounds, that some students are punished more than others. That was in the video too, that Ebony's more likely to be suspended, to be arrested than Emily. That's real life. That happens, right? And so this plays out within the walls of schools every single day. And so this video kind of helps us think about that and helps us think about moving into chapter 4, which is all about our organizational structures within schools that really perpetuate discrimination and racism and what we can do to disrupt that. So you might be wondering, how can there be so much segregation and racism still in our schools today? It's 2024. Haven't we moved past this? Um, I wish that we had. But when we really take a look at policies, practices, um, the ways that our schools operate, there still are a lot of issues of discrimination built in. And some might be saying, well, gosh, we desegregated schools years ago in terms of race. But when we think about how schools really are structured and where schools are at, and how, as in the video, housing and all of the different things that play into it, we still have, in many places, pretty segregated schools in terms of kids from some neighborhoods going to school together and other kids not, some schools getting more funding than others, and that kind of thing. And so as we move into chapter 4 and talk about structural and organizational issues, we know that there are some policies and practices that really perpetuate or exacerbate this inequality within our society and particularly within our schools. And so we've talked about things like ways that students are disciplined. And that's my main area of research. And so this is obviously something that's really important to me. But I think when we really look at who gets suspended, who gets expelled, and why, we should question, like, why do we continue to do this the way that we do? Because it really doesn't benefit students. Do we want violence in our schools? Do we want, children being completely disruptive? No, obviously not. But is removing them from school really the best way to address these issues, or just turning it back to families and saying, you need to do something to control your children? Probably not. And so what could we be doing differently? And that's really what we want to be thinking about in this class and in this chapter in particular. And so in chapter 4, we look at a variety of different issues that really kind of keep things the way that they are, which isn't necessarily a good thing. And so we're going to be looking at things like tracking and retention and standardized testing and all of these different things that play into our schools sometimes continuing to be places where students face discrimination for a variety of different reasons. And so, for example, when we think about tracking, if you were in school, in the limited role of teachers, limited role of family, in your school, in most schools, there are specific tracks for kids who are at advanced levels, who are at kind of like average levels, and maybe at lower levels. That's one way that we differentiate instruction for students, which, we know that differentiating instruction is a good thing. What is a problem with tracking is that when you have students who are tracked into those higher, middle, lower levels, whatever that might be, that sometimes then equates to opportunities that some children just do or do not have. All right. So for example, I'll use my daughter's example. She was in elementary school, and everybody's in pretty much, they're in the same class, they might be in different reading levels, things like that. But then she gets to middle school and they have honors math, double honors math, and just everybody else math, right? And what I didn't understand is that if you don't get into honors or double honors math, there's very little opportunity for you to get into more advanced math classes once you get to high school, which then also equates to often college entry. So it's crazy to think, here she is in 6th grade, and I'm an educator. I should kind of, I guess, have an idea about these things. But she entered in that average math class, and she quickly tested into a higher math class, but wasn't able to go in because of numbers and the number of students in different classes. And so I really advocated as her mother to be able to get her into those higher math classes. All right. I'm an educator. I'm fine with communicating with superintendents and all the different types of people in power because I do that on a regular basis. Not everybody has the understandings in the system. is able to advocate for their child in that way. And so I use that as an example of a very simple thing that is intended to benefit students, like, the students who are advanced. And I'm not saying that I don't want those children to continue to advance. I want everybody to continue to advance. But there shouldn't be opportunities provided for some students that aren't provided for all students. All right. Also, gifted and talented programs. Many schools have done away with gifted and talented programs because, again, those students are then segregated from the rest of the school population, and there isn't this feeling of community, equity, accessibility, and etc. So that's a little bit about tracking. And you've probably all had your own experiences with taking AP courses and things like that. Retention. So there's been debate for many, many years about students being retained if they aren't successful or not. So that's basically holding them back a year or so on. Research shows that retention is actually not very good for students. Most of the time, students are retained because of maturity versus academic preparedness or where they're at academically, which if they're retained, then they have to kind of navigate a whole new social system. It's not to say that retaining isn't always, that's always bad, but it should really be used probably less frequently, where what we should be doing is thinking about the supports that child needs to be successful where they're at. Okay. Standardized testing. Standardized testing, we know, tends to be discriminatory. Standardized testing is not good for students with disabilities, really anyone out of that dominant cultural group. Minorities, people who speak languages other than English, people with disabilities tend to not do as well on standardized testing as other children who are in those dominant groups. And so we might question why we continue to do standardized testing. Many people do question that, and that has shifted some over time, but we still use that as a hallmark for where students are at, how students get into higher level classes and things related to tracking, how it's decided if a student is retained or not. So high stakes decisions are based on these standardized tests, which we know are not necessarily a good and accurate representation of student learning. So we need to think about that. The curriculum that we use, who writes the curriculum? Who decides on what that curriculum looks like, right? Is that curriculum really inclusive of everyone in the school? Is it inclusive of accurate historical representations of what happened in this country? Right now, there's a huge debate in a lot of states around what is being taught, how it's being taught, which version of history is being taught, whether it's the real version or the version that people want us to believe. And so examining that and thinking about that is important when we're thinking about making sure that everybody understands what really is happening and what is taught is really best for everyone in the school. Pedagogy, how things are taught, and that is largely up to you as the teacher, but sometimes that is dictated by the school. And so we want to be thinking about that and what that looks like and what role you as a teacher play within that. The climate and physical structure of the building. How does it feel when you walk into the building? When you walk through and do a tour, you look at a school, are students segregated from each other in a variety of ways? And if so, why? All of those things matter. As a person who visits a lot of schools, I can tell you that it feels different in some places. You walk into the office and the way that you're greeted and the way that you're welcomed, depending on who you are and what your role is. Sometimes I've been in schools and I've been treated very kindly and warmly, and then a parent walks in and they're not at all treated kindly or warmly. And I question, why is that? Where does that come from? So those types of things matter. We've discussed disciplinary policies, and we'll get more into that later. Often students and teachers have a limited voice, and even family and community members, in what happens within the school. if that's the case, which it often is, we need to think about why that is. Whenever we limit people's access and voice and role within a system, it's often to keep those voices silent, to hold those people down, to keep some people in power and other people out. And so whenever that happens, we should always be looking at why that is and what is the impact of those voices being silent and not having a seat at the table. So this is a kind of run through of chapter 4, which is a lot more about that in the chapter itself, but I'm already at an hour and a half on our video, so I'm going to wrap this up. Something that we'll come back to later this summer is our expectations of students. And we talked about this with deficit thinking from chapter 1. When we have low expectations of our students, we know that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We've heard of that before. When we as teachers, when society has low expectations of someone, they tend to live up to those expectations. If we have high expectations, guess what? They live up to those expectations. And so we really need to think about how we are privileging some students and their voices and what they're learning over others, and the role that we play in making those decisions. So sometimes we base our expectations on the way that students dress and who their parents are and what we know about them, their language that they speak. And so we need to try to sometimes set aside these expectations that may cloud our thoughts and our beliefs about what a student is able to do and accomplish, so that we can really focus on what a child can do versus what a child cannot do. So research shows that expectations matter. There's a little video that I'll include, and this is actually about mice and rats. I think it's mice, and even expectations for animals. If we believe that they're going to do something or behave badly, they tend to do it, right? If we believe they're going to succeed and perform highly, they do it. So if that's true for mice in a maze, imagine what that's, if you can imagine that that's absolutely true for children as well. Okay, so sorry, we're at an hour and 30 minutes. You can take pauses throughout. This is by far and away the heaviest in terms of reading and content in this module. So thank you for persisting and making it through. As you know, this Sunday you have your discussion forum that is due. And for next week, you have chapter 6. You only have one chapter to read. I'm going to go back over to our course calendar because I put in here that you have another assignment due that you don't. So I'm like, wait a minute, that's not right. I put in that your social issues paper is due at the end of this week, which it's not due until the 30th. So look at this, don't look at that. I'll change that before I put the PowerPoint up. So by Sunday, make sure that you complete your second reflective discussion, that you respond to at least one of your classmates, hopefully more, and that you work your way through this module and all of the readings. So for next week, we'll talk about chapter 6, discussion 3 is due, and your social issues paper is due as well. I think that is it for now. I will do a separate little video overview of the social issues paper so that you can learn a little bit more about that and what you need to do for that assignment. I hope everyone is doing well, and I will talk with you soon.